Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Post with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Folks, I'm so excited today to be joined by Mr. Brian Barnhart, the voice of the Illinois Fighting Illini since 2002. He's been there for nearly 2 decades, a native of the state of Illinois. So glad to be joined by him today. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Billy, good to be on with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to start off with, for sure. Well, I want to start off with first, how have you been handling this pandemic? I mean, this is something that has impacted our lives both professionally and personally in the last year. So how have you been handling this last year?
Well, it's funny. I also do a show here in Champaign, and when we talk to different people, that's one of the first questions I ask them. So it's kind of interesting you would ask that of me. It was a very, very strange year, to say the least. I think the biggest thing was when the pandemic started a year ago, we didn't know if there was going to be any games at all. I mean, we were just entering this big void of, are we even going to play? And then the Big Ten in about August or so said, yeah, we're going to start these dates. And then they canceled it a couple of days later. And then they came back a few weeks later and said, okay, we're going to start late October. So there was kind of the emotion of that, kind of back and forth and not knowing exactly. And then finally, we were able to start in late October. It was very strange. Our first game we actually traveled to, which was rare this year. We didn't normally go to the games. So Wisconsin's about a 4-hour drive. And so we just drove up to Madison, an empty stadium. It was really cold and empty. And we lost the game, but that was kind of our first game. From that point on, pretty much all the road games we did in a studio in Champaign, basically calling the games off of television, which is an adventure in itself. We can talk about that. And then the home games we did in an empty stadium in our booth. I wouldn't say entirely empty because as it turned out, the players had family members that could come. So there were a few people in the stands, but it just wasn't nearly the same. And so that was, I took a lot of mental adjustment because particularly in radio, the audio and the crowd noise is such a vital part of what happens. It's what tells the listener that big things are happening, and it's an excitement in the announcer's voice. You kind of feed off of that. So that wasn't easy, but we got through it. We got most of the football games and most of the basketball games in, not as many as we would like, but we got, a pretty good run in considering all that was out there.
For sure. And you have ties to the state of Virginia. In fact, you attended Liberty University. I was wondering, when did you first know you wanted to become a sportscaster?
Well, it was basically at Liberty because I went out there to be a history major. I wasn't really going to do a whole lot. I mean, radio, I was in high school, I was very, very shy and very introverted. And so when I got out there, fortunately at Liberty, we had it was a fairly new school at the time. It was only about 10 years old when I got out there. And so I met a friend in the broadcasting part of the school, Mike Tilley, who still does their football games on TV to this day. But he and I became friends, and we just started doing games on the local school station, which could only be heard in the dorms. When you stepped outside the dorm, you couldn't hear it anymore. It was fixed in the dorms, and did a lot of shows and just did a lot of really down to earth, nuts and bolts type broadcasting nobody, hardly anybody was paying attention. So it was a great experience, but that's where I fell in love with it. Doing it for the local campus station, for the local cable TV station in Lynchburg, as it turned out, for free, doing a lot of different things. We did about everything we could. And because Liberty was so small, you had all kinds of opportunities. You didn't have to wait your turn or wait for seniority. If you wanted to do a women's game on a Thursday night, you just did it. And so that was a great experience for us.
And you also had a chance after you graduated to call games in the minor leagues. I was reading, Brian, I don't know if it's true, you called games with a young Joe Buck. If that's true, I mean, what do you remember calling games with one of the great announcers of our time?
Yeah, actually we did. It was in AAA baseball. I started in minor league baseball in Lynchburg in Class A, and then moved over to Salem, Virginia, which is Roanoke. Was over there for a year, and then I moved up to AAA. I forget how old I was, 22 or 23, I guess, at the time. And in AAA baseball, I was the only announcer. I had no color person. It was me. I did all the games, all 144 games by myself, very few days off. And so in Louisville, they had 2 announcers. They had Jim Kelch, who wound up doing radio for the Reds for several years. And then Joe Buck was just a student out of Indiana. And so he was the number 2 guy. So whenever we went to Louisville, I would have him come down and sit in with me because I just wanted an inning or 2 off now and then. And so whenever we were in Louisville or he was in Oklahoma City, I'd have him come in and do games with me, for a couple of innings. And he was really good then. I mean, he was only 21 or 22, not much, about my age, basically. And you could tell he was going to do a lot of big things.
That's great to hear. And so how did this opportunity come up with the Fighting Illini?
Well, it's kind of a long story. I was in Oklahoma City for about 10 years. I did the minor league, the AAA team for the Rangers there for those years. I also did minor league hockey. I did high school football. I did high school basketball. I did about everything you can imagine. Wherever there was an opportunity to do something play-by-play, I did it. And so then eventually I wound up I host talk shows in Oklahoma City, and I did different things like that. And I'd sent some resumes out. I interviewed with the Texas Rangers, finished in the top 2 or 3 for that. I interviewed with the Dallas Mavericks, interestingly enough. Didn't get that. And then I interviewed with the Anaheim Angels. They called me in February 98. And they said, hey, we've had a guy who's sick, who's ill. He can't, we've got your tape, cassette tape back then, of course, a little different than today. But my first reaction was, what tape? I'd sent out so many tapes, I didn't really remember sending them one, but they heard it. And I flew out there for an interview, and they offered me the job. I got hired. And so I did the Angels for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, they were wanting to change their format a little bit. We had 2 play-by-play guys. Mario Impemba was my radio partner. He was in Detroit doing TV for a long time after that. But they basically said, we want to play-by-play and a color guy. And I was kind of the junior member of the team. So they just said, we're not renewing your contract. So I thought, well, I'll come back to Champaign where I grew up. And I started working at the local station in Champaign that my parents and grandparents all listened to when I was growing up. And so I got hired by them just to do some announcing in the morning. And anyway, one thing led to another over the course of the next couple of years. And the longtime voice of the team, Jim Turpin, retired. And so the U of I approached me. They kind of knew my background a little bit. And I interviewed for the job. And in 2002, as you mentioned, I took over. So it was basically a situation where the job ended in California. Had that job not ended, I probably wouldn't have come back. And as it turned out, a year or 2 later, I became the voice of the team.
And you've been with Illinois for almost the last 2 decades. I was wondering, what are some of your favorite memories behind the mic for the Fighting Illini? I have to think that special 2005 season with men's basketball is a standout. Went to the national championship game against UNC, had a great win against Arizona to get to the Final Four. I'm sure that's got to stand out in terms of one of the great moments of your career.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that year definitely is probably the top year. We thought we were headed for another year like that this year with Ayo Dosunmu and Kofi Coburn and all that happened. And of course, Loyola kind of ended that season a little prematurely in the NCAA tournament. But yeah, I would say the 05 team still is probably, I don't know, I've always described it as it was the closest thing to traveling with a group of rock stars that I'll never experience but that was about as close because they were so popular. Everybody knew them by their first name, D Brown, D, Darren, Luther, James, and Roger. Same 5 starters, all 39 games, started 29-0, ended some long losing streaks to different teams along the way. Had a big win at Wisconsin in January of that year. Those are big games. But you mentioned the Arizona game. It was the Elite Eight. After we had lost 1 game to Ohio State on just about a buzzer beater, basically. And we win the Big Ten tournament. We go into the NCAA tournament, win the Elite Eight. Arizona was really good that year. And we played them at the old DePaul home arena out by the airport in Chicago. And it was packed. It was, jam-packed, but it was probably 95% Illinois fans because it was in Chicago. And it was really cold that day, too. I got kind of hoarse because it was really, really cold. And by the end of the game, you can kind of tell my voice is starting to trail off because we were sitting on ice basically in the arena, All-State Arena. So yeah, that moment, the loudness of it coming down from 15 with 4 minutes to go, the just unbelievable season we had to that point. Yeah, it still is probably, even, and calling the Final Four in the national title game was fantastic, obviously. But I think that Arizona game probably remains to this day still the number one moment that I've experienced all these years.
So, Brian, I was wondering, obviously you've gotten to cover some great moments with the team. How do you process the tough losses as a broadcaster? Again, to UNC in the championship game, this year to Loyola Chicago. As a broadcaster, how do you process that moment and do your job to tell the story on the air?
Yeah, it's I grew up an Illini fan. I grew up here. So the games are a little more, it's more than just a job to me. It's my team. So there's a little bit of that mixed in. But yeah, I think my number one job is to paint a picture for the listener, to have them able to see what I'm seeing in a clear manner, describe it for them, make them, if I've done my job. And I'll get these emails occasionally from people. I had to pull over on the side of the road because I couldn't, I had to concentrate on what was happening. So if I've done that, I've done my job in that sense. But the wins, you want to win. The Loyola game this year was frustrating just because we had played so well. We had won 14 out of 15. We had won at Michigan, blew them out in their own building. We had won at Ohio State. We had won the Big Ten tournament. It seemed like we were hitting our stride. And in that game, as a broadcaster, it was just frustrating because you could see early on that Loyola wanted to throw the first punch and land some punches early, and they did. And we just never got up off the mat. And as the game went on, you just kept looking at the clock going, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to happen. And so that was frustrating. But, overall, whether it's a loss like that or a big win like Arizona, you're calling the championship game, I always approach every game the same, whether it's a preseason game that doesn't count, exhibition game, or the national title game. The way I approach the game is the same regardless. My preparation, the name of the guys on the team. I've just always done it that way for 30 plus years. And so, you just try to be professional and still, express your excitement or your disappointment, as the case may be, and just try to paint a picture as clearly as you can.
I wanted to ask you about a few people that you've had a chance to cover in your nearly 2-decade career at Illinois. I was wondering, do you have a great Deron Williams story? He was obviously a leader of that 2005 team. He ended up becoming an NBA All-Star. Any great stories you can share about Darren?
Well, the big thing with Darren is he came in, he was a little overweight, actually. And of the two players that year that came in, really heralded Mr. Basketball, D. Brown. He had the personality. He had the headband. Darren was just like a really talented guy from Texas that at the time Bill Self was able to get to come to Champaign. And so, and then when Bruce Weber took over, and I think what's interesting about Darren is the first year he was a little overweight, slightly, a little slow. He wasn't a great player at that point, but he had a collision with a guy in an early season game where he broke his jaw. He literally ran into a pick and never saw it coming. And he literally was out for about a week or so. They wired his jaw shut. He couldn't eat, and he lost all kinds of weight. And then the next year he came back and he had gotten a lot stronger. He had dropped the fat and he had just gotten stronger. And then by the time, even the sophomore year, he was good. But then by the junior year is when he really moved past D. Brown and became, whatever it was, the third pick in the draft, after Chris Paul. And so it was just fun to watch his evolution from a kid that, yeah, he's a good player, he's okay, to, oh, he's pretty good, he's really changed his body, to, oh my goodness, this guy's an NBA, top pick. So, and Darren was just great to be around. He was great with his teammates. He was a really good teammate. And so I think those are the biggest things I remember about him.
Any great stories about Bill Self before he went to Kansas?
Yeah, Bill is the best I've ever seen. And I knew about Bill a little bit when I lived in Oklahoma City because he was an assistant at Oklahoma State. Not that I knew him, but I knew of him. And then he got the job at Oral Roberts, and he was at Tulsa. And then he comes to Champaign about the year I arrived back in Champaign. And the thing with Bill is he knew how to motivate players, and he could be tough on them. Don't get me wrong. He could be really, really tough in practice, but he could also give him a pat on the back and laugh with him and tease him about something. And he was one of the best I've ever seen at I remember being at a meal. We were at a barbecue place in Memphis or something, and then we had donors on the trip, and you got the team. So the team and the donors and the broadcasters, coaches are all eating at this barbecue place in Memphis. And Bill was just moving from table to table, talking to the donors. He was a hit with them. Then he'd go over and josh with the players and make fun of them, and they're laughing at him. I mean, he was so good. He's the best I've ever seen at working a room and just basically taking over a room. He had a fantastic memory. He could remember things about you or your kids or your names of your kids. And he was something else. I can see why he's a really good recruiter and why he's had a lot of success at Kansas, because you could see that even at that young age.
What about Bruce Weber? Of course, he was the head coach of that 2005 team and is currently the head coach at Kansas State.
Yeah, Bruce was one of the most down-to-earth people I've ever met. He was a guy that, worked his way up. He was an assistant for Gene Cady for a long time at Purdue. He got passed over several jobs, finally took the job at Southern Illinois. And then when Bill left for Kansas, Bruce, didn't actively campaign for the job, but he let people know that he's interested. And so he eventually got the job. And we had played him a couple of times when he was at Southern. And as I got to know him, again, he was just one of the most down-to-earth, transparent. He just tell you what he thought. Now, sometimes it got him in trouble. He would get in trouble with the Chicago media because he would say certain things about players. He's just being honest. He's just saying, yeah, so-and-so should have played better. And, he got some heat for that, some blowback from that. But this is a guy that, he would, as much money as he was making, and I forget what his salary was at Illinois, but he would come in with coupons for the grocery store, and he would literally shop at the local grocery store using his coupons. And he would come in the day after Halloween and a whole bag of candy. And we're like, Coach, what is this? He goes, well, I got it for half off, all this candy from Halloween. I mean, he was just that way. He was so human and so kind. And he would, he was just, and eventually at the end, he had some recruiting issues and eventually got let go. But I really respect him as a human being and as an X and O coach. I find very few better than him as far as coaching the X and O's of the game.
And on the football side, how about Lovie Smith? I mean, he was a guy that obviously went to a Super Bowl with the Bears, came to Illinois, didn't have much success there. But what do you remember about Lovie Smith in his time with the Fighting Illini?
Well, the funny thing is with Lovie is that, I knew everybody knew who he was because he had coached the Bears to the Super Bowl and, had a lot of success, won several division titles. And so those of my age were like, wow, you mean like the Lovie Smith is coming, and I think he's very low key. He's what you see on TV is who he is. He's not outgoing that much. He's very polite and very friendly. And he had a little bit of a Texas accent, a little bit of a Southern accent in that regard, but he was a very classy, professional individual. And he was very much a mentor to the young men on the football team. They looked up to him very, very much. They respect, and of course their parents did too, because it's Lovie Smith, for heaven's sakes. He just, it took a while to rebuild when he started, and it kind of got off to a slow start there. Got a late start because he wasn't hired till, pretty late in the process the first year. So the first year felt like kind of an audition, like different guys were auditioning for jobs and we happened to be playing games. But then as the years went on, eventually, not this last year, the COVID year, but the year before is when they finally seemed to be going in the right direction. They got to a bowl game. They won a big comeback win at Michigan State. They knocked off Wisconsin with a last-second field goal. Wisconsin had been undefeated and basically unscored upon. They won that game. I always remember those games, but I just always remember how professional he was, very classy individual. But the bottom line is you got to win games. And if you're not winning games, it doesn't matter how classy you are or how polite you are or how good you are with your young men. You got to move on.
What are some of your favorite places to travel in the Big Ten? I mean, there's so many great iconic places to call a game from, or even just visit the city and the town around the stadium. What are some of your favorite places to go in the Big Ten?
Well, I would say football wise, Camp Randall Stadium when it's always usually full, and they do the fourth, the hop around or the dance around or whatever, jump around, I guess is what it is. And the press box kind of rocks back and forth. That's a great atmosphere. Penn State is just unbelievable setting. I mean, it's in the middle of the mountains in central Pennsylvania, and it's just very, very pretty. And it's a big stadium. Love going to Minneapolis. The town itself is great. I mean, usually you stay downtown and there's just a lot to see and do down there. Those are some of my favorites. I think football. I would say basketball wise, I always love going to the barn in Minneapolis because it's, built in 1928, be 100 years old here later this decade. It's got an old school feel to it. It's got the elevated floor. It's got a great sound on the radio just because it sounds old. So for someone like me who's a little older, it's a pretty cool place. Mackey Arena is, I think, easily the loudest arena. When they're rolling in there, you cannot hear yourself think. I mean, it is so loud. That's one of those games where our engineer has to really work hard to keep the levels at a certain point because you just get blown out if you're not careful. But I like going to Purdue, to Mackey. Of course, I mentioned Williams Arena. Those are two older arenas. Rutgers has kind of a cool old building. It's unique in that sense, the RAC. So there's really, every arena has its own unique characteristic. They've really improved the one in Michigan. Chrysler Center used to be really dark and dingy, and they really cleaned it up, and it's nice now. So, yeah, those are some of my favorites.
How do you prepare for a game? I mean, let's just say you've got an Illinois Big Ten matchup against Michigan State. How are you preparing if the game's on Saturday, the days leading up to the game? And then how does that differ for basketball?
Well, I spend probably 6 to 8 hours for each game on football. I start early in the week, and I basically, get my score sheet laid out with the names and the numbers and where they're from, and I do all that. I do all that by hand. I know a lot of guys do it, computer spreadsheet or whatever, but for me, it helps me to remember it, and that's just the way I've always done it. So whatever works for anybody. I always tell young broadcasters, you can do it however you want it, whatever works for you, do that. But I try to have the names and numbers and all that. And then I type up some different notes for each team from their game notes or from different things, what they've done this season against different opponents. And so ran for 250 yards against this opponent. And so some individual notes. So by the time I get all that done, I try to be done with that by Thursday. And then basically on Friday, I'll start on the next week's game, just kind of work ahead a little bit. Kind of like writing a song. You just kind of keep picking at it a little bit every day. So it takes 6 to 8 hours probably for a football game. Basketball, I can get it ready in 2 to 3 hours. There's just more of them. And then the biggest thing, and we didn't have so much, well, I guess we did this year with the COVID year. We had November and December were overlapped a lot. But you might have a basketball game on Thursday or Friday, a football game on Saturday, and a basketball game on Sunday, and a basketball game on Tuesday. So if you think 2 to 3 hours for each basketball game and 6 to 7 hours for the football, in November, you're doing a lot of prep and a lot of games.
I was wondering, Brian, what's your advice to aspiring sportscasters trying to make it during this pandemic? I mean, you know better than anyone, it's already a competitive business. Now we have to deal with the realities of this pandemic. So what's your advice to young guys and girls like me who want to get into this field of sportscasting?
Well, are you talking specifically about the pandemic or just in general?
Just in general, if you want to incorporate the pandemic as well.
Well, I think the pandemic's made it hard, of course. This has been a strange year. I don't know. This year, you almost have to throw out, any any advice because this last year was different for all of us. I mean, calling a game off of TV was just, I remember the first game we did, and I'll get to your question here, but first game we did, I forgot to write down the score as I was calling it from the studio off the TV, and they went to break. And of course on TV, they just go to break. They don't leave the score up other than they show it real quick or we're back in a moment. So I had to remember I got to write down the score and the score and the time because they don't do that for you. So things like that. There's all kinds of obstacles we had to overcome this year that are unique. But my biggest thing is I always tell young broadcasters is whatever experience you can get And there's so many more chances now. I mean, with this, like this podcast, a Zoom podcast, whatever you want to do, you can kind of start out and experiment with sportscasting. And, you can set yourself up and record a game and do it yourself and send it out there on a link and see how you sound. I think the biggest thing is just get as much experience as you can. If there's a local high school or a local college or a junior college, talk to the sports information director and say, hey, would you mind if I sat in an empty booth and just called a game, for myself, and then do the prep and do, practice prepping your sheets and prepping your game and then record it somehow and then go back and listen to it and just say, oh yeah, I said that too much, or I shouldn't have done that, or boy, that was too repetitive, or I wasn't, I sounded like I was bored or whatever, just listen to it and just kind of get as much stuff on tape or whatever as you can, and then critique yourself. And I always encourage people too. And I just got one today from a guy up in Northern Illinois who does one of the schools up north. And he said, I'd like you to critique my tape, or critique my work. And so don't be afraid to send out to people that that are in the broadcast industry to say, hey, would you mind listening to this? Because that's what I did. I sent it to different, the voice of the Texas Rangers and different guys that I knew to say, literally critique me, tell me where I can get better. And I think if you're open to that, and if you get a lot of practice and a lot of opportunities, no matter what they pay, I mean, and I can tell you and I don't think it's changed much in 30 years. When you start out, you're not making a lot of money. I mean, you're doing it for free or very little money, but don't let that stop you. I mean, do it, practice it, do it. You can learn how to do this. I mean, I took classes too that helped in different areas, but there's nothing like just doing it over and over and over again. And you just kind of learn what works and what doesn't work. The other thing I would say is be yourself. Don't try to copy, everything somebody does. But what I did over the years was I would take different things from different guys that, I like the way they approach that, or I like the way that sounds, and kind of make your own style or own favorite phrase or whatever, and just kind of let it develop that way.
There's definitely some great piece of advice right there. I was wondering, Brian, because you mentioned you called the Angels for a few years. What are some of the biggest similarities and differences between covering a major league team and covering a college team like Illinois?
Well, the biggest, the similarity is the games. I mean, the games are the games. You have a job to do, and it doesn't really matter whether you're calling a game from Fenway Park or Yankee Stadium or whatever the case may be. It's it's still the same. Although there were times in those couple of years where I'd pinch myself, going, "Am I really here? I mean, this is unbelievable." With 50,000 people at Yankee Stadium and so forth. So, but the game is the game. But the biggest difference, the pros, the emphasis from the media standpoint is on the players. I mean, the manager does his interviews every day and everybody knows who the manager is, but the point of emphasis and the stars of the team tend to be the players, obviously. You get to the college level, especially in basketball, but football too, the stars of the team, in a sense, are the coaches. I mean, they're the ones everybody knows. And so when you're in the professional ranks as a play-by-play or broadcaster, you're more involved with the players than you are the manager. You are part with the manager with the rest of the media, but your focus is on the players. In college, because most colleges pretty tightly, I mean, coaches have a lot of control over when their players speak and who's available to the media. And so the coaches are really the keys. So the relationship you develop in college, and I've been fortunate, I've had some great guys to work with and have good relationships with all of them. But the keys to the relationship are with the coach. The coach has to trust you. The coach has to have that good relationship with you, that if he tells you something and he doesn't necessarily want it out until a certain time, I can't be the scoop. I can't be Scoop Brady or, whoever. That's not my job. My job is to be part of the team broadcast. And so you work pretty closely and you develop a good relationship with the coach. And that's probably the biggest difference.
Brian, you've been so gracious with your time. I have one final question for you, and that is, as you reflect on your career, are you pretty content with how it's played out? I mean, You covered a major league team for a few years. You worked in local TV. You've been with the Fighting Illini for nearly 2 decades now. As you reflect on your career, are you pretty happy with how everything's happened? I mean, is there an event? Is there something you wish you could have done? Or all being said, pretty happy with how your career has played out up to this point?
Oh, pretty happy with everything, how it's played out. I can tell you, I did not expect to be the voice of the Illini at any point. When I was asked in college, at Liberty, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to do Major League Baseball, which I had no idea how difficult it is to get to that level. I had no clue. I'm just like, oh yeah, I want to be a major league announcer. So, and it wasn't because I didn't think I would want to do the Illini. It's because I didn't think the job would ever be open. I mean, I just had no idea. And so it was always a job that I thought, well, that would be cool to do the games back in my hometown and home area, but that's probably not going to happen. So I didn't give it a lot of thought other than that over the years. And there were a couple of times I had a job offer in Pawtucket, Rhode Island one year where they offered me the job on the phone without an interview. I was in Oklahoma City, but I didn't want to move at that point. And so I turned it down. And then I thought 2 or 3 years later, man, maybe I should have taken it. I might have been in Boston, at some point, because that was kind of the pathway for the Pawtucket announcers. They wound up in Boston. So, I thought about that at the time. But you know what? I really don't have any regrets in that sense. I mean, it was when you're in that moment and you got to make that decision, you just kind of, put your faith in place and just say, I think it'll work out just fine. And it's turned out it has. When I got the job with the Angels, I thought I'd be out there the rest of my life. I didn't even think about, and then suddenly the job was over. And then I had to decide what to do. And so I came back home, and then kind of one thing led to another. And here it is. So, 20 some years later. So yeah, I'm very happy with the way it's turned out. But along the way, there's no doubt you think, should I have turned left or right or done this or that? But no, I've been very, very fortunate to, I really can't do anything else. I don't know how to do anything else other than this. And I get to host a talk show now here that's been on the air in Champaign for 70 years and succeeded the guy that I succeeded doing the games. He did the show for 40 years. And so I'm getting a chance to talk to our local audience every day about everything, sports, politics, news, and also to do play-by-play. So I'm very happy where it's settled. And I just enjoy it every day, and every day I get to do it, I consider it a blessing. So,
Brian, this has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you about your great career and all the great stories you can share. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you chatting with me.
Well, you're very welcome. Thanks, Billy. Good luck.
Thanks so much to Brian Barnhart, the longtime voice of the Illinois Fighting Illini since 2002. He's been there for nearly 2 decades. This has been the latest edition of The Pulse with BP. Thanks to everybody for joining us. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. We'll see you next time.